Good morning. I'd very much like to thank Rolf Oye and Christian Schulte for the kind invitation and indeed for this initiative. I'm very much pleased to be a part of this forum, and I thank all of you for coming out on this holiday. Well, the signatories of the Oberhausen Manifesto were filmmakers and activists. They also positioned themselves as film critics with an acute, albeit apodictic, awareness of film history. Blending a harsh critique with a constructive resolve, their succinct statement, its concision itself a blunt instrument, announced the collapse of the conventional German film, reiterating the news of its demise in the emphatic closing, which declared that the old film is dead, before expressing a certain optimism, we believe in the new one. Both a devastating prognosis and a program for renewal, the document demanded a departure from the past, an Abschied von gestern, and sketched a design for the future. To be sure, this promise of a fresh start bore a curious resemblance to the wishful thinking of Stunde Null rhetoric that had circulated in Germany shortly after World War II, with its tacit belief that one could indeed start from scratch. Against formidable odds, and they were imposing, the manifesto precipitated radical changes in the way films in West Germany were funded and made, and it profoundly altered the equation with respect to the question of who would make them, with an immediacy, a vehemence, a pertinacity that's truly astonishing. I think you only need to compare the efficacy of Oberhausen to that of another manifesto. It's curiously not mentioned in the German press at all in these discussions, and I'm speaking of the first statement of the New American Cinema Group, which was also issued in 1962 in September, and I think that proves the point. That manifesto really did not have did not yield the results that we found in Oberhausen. And if only a very few of the filmmakers who endorsed the statement would ultimately achieve some measure of international renown, the manifesto undeniably forced the opening that made possible the extraordinary creative outpourings that put West German film at the forefront of international cinema during the 1970s and 80s. As we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the document signing, and it's not, as Rolf Oye said, it's not just a celebration. I think it's a somehow it's a Bestandsaufnahme, it's a taking of stock. I think we would do well to recall the energies that spawned this now legendary pronouncement and gave it such potency as a movement and longevity as an ideal. Already in its first bloom, the cinema of authors that we can trace back to Oberhausen was proud and willful. I mean, they were really cocky, both self-important and self-indulgent. Its practitioners viewed their convocation as a gathering of Davids waging war against an army of Goliaths. Without question, this West German template exercises strong influence in subsequent attempts in the United States to conceptualize an independent cinema. From the countercultural ambitions of the renegades behind Easy Rider in 1967, to the anti-Hollywood aesthetic of Jim Jarmusch and Amos Poe in the 1980s, to the delusional messianism and breathtaking self-regard of today's auteurs maudits such as Greg Araki, Vincent Gallo, and Harmony Korine. Indeed, the young German film constituted a proto-independent cinema long before there was a Sundance Institute or an independent film channel. Its members, both colleagues and competitors for pieces of a never large subsidy pie, were mavericks, indies avant la lettre, who defied integration into their dominant cinema and whose very strength and identity rested in their difference from and resistance to the mainstream. Difficult and demanding, the subsequent new German Autoren film would be taken as seriously as it was abroad, precisely because it was so vehemently disliked at home, rendering it an eccentric cultural ambassador that both spoke for the nation, often by speaking and acting out against it. It was vulnerable yet fierce, precarious yet uncompromising in its insistence that films did not always have to be popular or pleasing in order to justify their existence. The Oberhausen vendetta against the conventional German film was at once a response to established interests as well as to political apparatus. And to be sure, this ideological dismay owed much to Siegfried Kracauer's symptomatic criticism. To decry the conventional was to disdain the legacy of UFA, Germany's principal and in equal measure renowned and infamous film studio, and to applaud its post-war dismantling and the demise of everything that it stood for, especially the well-made German film with its staid tradition of quality, a tradition that had dutifully and diligently served the National Socialist order. The young filmmakers rejected the cinema of their elders, particularly its cultural perspective, its cozy relations with established interests and reactionary politics. As a purveyor of distraction and products of a wannabe culture industry, the Adenauer era's popular cinema had had no progressive advocates. Moreover, as symptoms of a society ostensibly beset by collective amnesia, this fantasyware, in keeping with Alexander and Margareta Mitscherlich's influential thesis about repressed guilt in post-war West German culture at large, I'm thinking of their book Die Unfähigkeit zum Trauern of 1967, this fantasyware was viewed by the young filmmakers with suspiciousness for taking flight from the past and failing to confront and work through a nation's collective investment in the Hitler regime and the Holocaust. The fabled Oberhausen Manifesto, the object of our forum, would provide the founding myth for what would become the young German film and later the new German cinema. In so doing, it articulated a critique of German cinema, and in this way it both reflected contemporary discussions, but it also would set agendas for the country's film critics, and I would add, for international film historians. What I'd like to do this morning is to position the legacy of Oberhausen in the larger context of film theory and film criticism within the Federal Republic of Germany. And in this endeavor, I want to particularly focus on the seminal importance of one writer in particular. Siegfried Kracauer's work on film had a profound, albeit in some ways odd, resonance in the FRG. A central notion from his theory of film of 1960, hunger for life, became the impetus for the most compelling depiction of leftist subjectivity in the post-1968 epoch. I'm thinking of Michael Rutschke's monograph Erfahrungshunger, an essay über die 70er Jahre, which came out in 1980. It couldn't have been more different in Anglo-American circles, though, where Kracauer barely figured in the seminal exchanges of the so-called screen studies era. At best, film theory, a theory of film gained scholarly attention as a belated contribution to classical film theory. In the main, however, Kracauer functioned either as a convenient straw man for eschewers of a naive realism, and even more so than André Bazin, who came under, I think, considerable critique, or as the author of From Caligari to Hitler, he served as a popular target for opponents of a reductive sociological film historiography. Well, how are we to take this disparity of reception? How do you explain the enthusiasm for Kracauer in the FRG? Is it an anomaly? Is it an anachronism? Is it a function of the undeveloped state of discourse about film in post-war Germany, both East and West, as well as Austria and Switzerland, where well into the 1980s, most significant sustained discussion about the medium took place in journalistic venues? Through the 1970s, in fact, academic film studies remained virtually non-existent on West German campuses. Likewise, there was a conspicuous lack of significant film theorizing. To be sure, one might be tempted to surmise that this surprising regard for Kracauer came from the New Left, with its penchant for ideological criticism, especially when we bear in mind the renewed significance of the Frankfurt School's media theory for the student movement. As stated, though, it was theory of film and not the exemplar of symptomatic analysis from Caligari to Hitler, which would play the more significant role in the FRG during the 70s. In the following, I'd like to suggest how and why Kracauer appealed so vividly to post-68 sensibilities in the Federal Republic, and to elaborate how theory of film in this specific national and temporal context came to take on meanings unknown and unappreciated by international cineasts and cinephiles. So a few words about Kracauer's post-war courses in time. The history of discourse about cinema and the FRG, one might argue, has to a great extent depended on which of Kracauer's two film books was privileged. If From Caligari to Hitler influenced much writing about film from the late 50s through the late 60s, it would be theory of film that had the stronger impact in the next decade. The most noteworthy West German film journals of the 60s, and I'm thinking of obviously Filmkritik, but also Film and Filmstudio, which came out of Frankfurt, consciously deferred and sought to continue Kracauer's critical project, that is, to illuminate the ideological contents and social meanings of contemporary film production. Although commentators paid lip service to the importance of formal concerns, their actual critical praxis remained exceedingly thematic, so much so that Kracauer, in an otherwise supportive letter of March 1956 to the editors of Film 56, a forerunner of Filmkritik, suggested that his young writers would do well to expand their focus. And let me quote, this is really a surprising letter. I believe that this sociological approach to film production is most necessary, he says. Nonetheless, I would be happier if in the future you would be more systematic about seeking out what is socially and politically false in the aesthetic realm as well. At present, it seems to me as if you're being too one-sided in your emphasis on manifest content. Enno Patalas's and Wilfried Berghans' programmatic essay of 1961, Gibt es eine linke Filmkritik, is interesting in that it encapsulates Kracauer's impetus. The authors cite From Caligari to Hitler as film critique's decisive role model. And I think we might put this intervention into a dialogue with the generational revolt of the Oberhausen signatories, all the more since we know that the film critique contributors Enno Patalas and Wilfried Berghans were in active touch with the rebel filmmakers, all the more since we know that T.W. Adorno was friends with Kluge and a public supporter of the young filmers' endeavors, all the more since we know that Adorno was in correspondence with Kracauer about the new signs of life in West German cinema. Contrasting an old school of culinary film appreciation, and I think they had in mind Günter Grohl, Friedrich Luft, Karl Korn, with a progressive new criticism, the editors of Filmkritik privileged an approach more interested in social content than aesthetic form, even if they considered form to be part of the content. The critic, they said, should seek to comprehend the audience and its wishes, especially because the spectator had heretofore remained underappreciated. And that sounds very much like Alexander Kluge. The new criticism searches for unspecific latent messages, reveals the predilections of the director, hopes for a socially responsible film, pays attention to production-related concerns, and criticizes the society that produces certain films. Now, Patalas would go on to nuance this initiative in his plaidoyer for eine ästhetische Linke, and that was in July 1966. There he calls for a film criticism that is more sensitive to structures and processes, that does not allow an emphasis on ideological inscriptions to obscure a work's formal dimensions. Sociological criticism, he maintains, should understand aesthetic operations as social activities and activate aesthetic behavior. The problem of Kracauer's symptomatic approach, Helmut Farber would argue in the April 1967 number of Filmkritik, was that it concentrated on the zeitgeist of a film without adequately comprehending its Geist. Now, there would be a split in the editorial board of Filmkritik, and that split was one between political leftists and aesthetic leftists. And that ultimately would lead to a showdown and the subsequent resignation of the political wing in the spring of 1969. And if you look through the back issues of the journal, and it's something I highly recommend, it's really the level of writing, the kind of the level of the cinephilia, but also the kind of the political awareness and the way in which the two don't always mesh is really makes for a very, very good retrospective encounter. If you look through the pages of the journal, you find a marked shift of paradigms, a new penchant for ardent effusions that focus on the subjective dimension of the experience in the dark, a descriptive rather than prescriptive impetus, a preference for fragmentary observations and aphoristic willfulness, a tendency to be less concerned with the whole of a film than privileged moments. And in keeping with Susan Sontag's exemplary essay of 1964, a turn against interpretation because it denigrates rather than enhances aesthetic responses. So what happened was that the new editorial collective of Filmkritik distanced itself from the ideological emphases from Caligari to Hitler. And we have critics like Wim Wenders, Gerhard Theuring, Klaus Bederkerl, Wolf-Eckhard Bühler, Siegfried Kracauer, and they're all referred to, and not always, let us say, in terms of praise, as sensibilisten. As exponents of a private and personal relationship to the film experience, authors fond of saying I, they discovered dimensions of meaning in theory of film that surely had not been appreciated by the book's initial commentators. And I would say the initial reviews of Kracauer's volume when it came out in '64 were not exactly glowing. I remember one review in Film with the headline "Gottsched im Kino," and I don't think that was a compliment. Indeed, what Kracauer articulated as well as catalyzed was a unique form of cinephilia. When the study's German translation appeared, as I said, in '64, reviewers were surprised that it had so little in common with the Weimar essays that had been reissued in 1963 under the title Das Ornament der Masse. Where, reviewers wondered, was the critique of distraction and mention of the culture industry? Why was there not a single mention of Adorno or Die Dialektik der Aufklärung? Why would such an otherwise incisive social critic insist on divesting objects of their historical status and shrouding them in an undialectical, whimsical, and I'm thinking of Adorno's phrase, der wunderliche Realist, wunderlich, and even mystical idealism? As Helmut Leighton has observed, theory of film seemed to provide little intellectual sustenance for readers of the mid-'60s with progressive agendas. So this appropriation of Kracauer by the Munich sensibilists was, I mean, it's fair to say, decidedly selective. One drew on bits and pieces of theory of film. I think the whole of the work and its overarching realist argument rarely came under discussion. There was something willful about it. There was a form of kind of textual poaching going on here. In that regard, this response provides support for Miriam Hansen's later claim that Kracauer had not written a comprehensive theory of film, but rather a theory of a particular kind of film experience. Let me give you a couple examples of this discourse. Wim Wenders, inspired by theory of film's idiosyncratic cinephilia, repeatedly finds him thunderstruck by images that bring him closer to the concrete world. Kracauer, writes Wenders, quote, spoke of film as the redemption of physical reality, meaning the tenderness that cinema can show towards reality. Westerns, says Wenders, have often brought out this tenderness in a dreamily beautiful and quiet way. In their images, they spread out a surface that was nothing else but what you could see. Now, tenderness is not a word that Kracauer uses. Rather, I think he speaks of a restraint that allows images to maintain their integrity and not be forced into a narrative corset. There are moments in films, Wenders wrote in June 1970, quote, that are suddenly so unexpectedly direct and overwhelmingly concrete that you hold your breath or sit up straight or put your hand on your mouth. And he goes on to provide an inventory of privileged moments from a variety of films, strikingly concrete images from selected features, shots where an initial perception gives way to a play of affect. Let me quote again. Suddenly, there's nothing more to describe. Some things become all too clear and leapt out of the picture, become a feeling, a memory. For a moment, the film was a smell, a taste in the mouth, a tingle in the hands, a draft felt through a wet shirt, a children's book that you haven't seen since you were 5 years old, a blink of the eye. Or to use a final example, and this is Wim Wenders' 1969 notice on Werner Nekes' experimental film Kelek. It's a piece that ends with a quote from Theory of Film. Quote, all this means that films cling to the surface of things. Perhaps the way today leads from and through the corporeal to the subjective? Question mark. Well, these rhapsodic sensibilists, with their fetishistic embrace of haptic details and objets trouvés, by and large remained on the margins of intellectual discussion during the late 60s. They came under frequent attack for their candid displays of personal preference, for their unabashed willingness to give voice to what they saw and felt in the dark. Give you an example. In the June 1968 issue of Film, Kracauer assailed the sensibilists as denizens, quote, of a murky realm with an increasingly complicated and increasingly dead-ended subjectivity. They may call themselves nonconformists, but they are in truth reactionaries. They claim to be in touch with images and things, but in fact they are out of touch with reality. To fixate on things, on films as unique experiences, according to the sensibilist detractors, was to take things out of context. Let me quote from another comment by Heinz Ungereit from May '69. Ungereit writes, "The internalizing and totalizing of individual films divests them of their social determinations. All that remains is the solitary film, the solitary image, the solitary director." Well, in the wake of the failed student revolt of 1967 and 1968, even leftist commentators in West Germany, even people like Kracauer, although he was later to come to this kind of insight, would come to suspect that discourses which ruled out the subjective factor and the power of feelings might well be the function of authoritarian personalities. Unlike the intellectual activists who promulgated conceptual frameworks that could account for social reality in its totality, the sensibilists favored single moments and a selective attention, aiming to escape theoretical cubbyholes which for them remain abstract constructions devoid of experiential immediacy. They went to the movies to see, not to cerebrate, to discover the visual presence of the physical world far away from words and the dimension of verbal meanings. Like the eccentric spectator of theory of film, what they sought in cinema, to quote Kracauer, was perception, experience, contemplation, and not interpretation. Well, Michael Rutschke's Erfahrungshunger explicitly acknowledged Kracauer's pertinence for a larger understanding of culture in the FRG after 1968. Describing the widespread disaffection that attended the demise of the student movement, Rutschke saw a collective shift from a will to enact theoretical constructs to a desire to remain undefined by social mechanisms. The melancholy resulting from the collapse of a leftist public sphere brought a retreat into a lonely subjectivism. If anything, this new sensibility, which was referred to the time often disparagingly either as die neue Innerlichkeit or die neue Subjektivität, was out of touch with everything and everyone. The cinema in this context provided a welcome refuge from a threatening material world where objects, otherwise functionalized and commodified, gained new immediacy and tangibility, where one in general could breathe more easily. In the dark, one experiences a dreamlike fascination while enjoying the intensity of isolated images. The corporeal world becomes alive, freed from the conditioning forces that structure the everyday, liberated from the discursive frameworks that bind certain signs to particular associations, redeemed in that it comes to be felt and experienced in all its sensual richness. In the cinema, the world stops making sense, and in that way takes on new meanings that Kracauer had elaborated in his theory of film. I think the most crucial notion that Rutschke took from theory of film derived from Kracauer's comments on spectatorship, especially the emphasis on a disengaged specularity, a response that seeks Sinnlichkeit rather than Sinn, a gaze more concerned with haptic stimulation and tactile frisson than conceptual understanding. In chapter 9 of his book, Kracauer refers to Hugo von Hofmannsthal's essay of 1921, Ersatz für die Träume, a piece describing the working class's escape to the cinema and its search there for a fuller life, quote, in its exhaustibility, which the cinema offers to masses in want of it. Urban dwellers of modernity, says von Hofmannsthal, are out of touch with the breathing world around them, that stream of things and events which would render existence more exciting and significant. So common to von Hofmannsthal's essay, Kracauer's book, and the new subjectivity of the 70s in general, according to Rutschke, was an all-consuming Erfahrungshunger. The recognition that the modern world has become impossibly abstract and complex, beyond all synthesis and simplification. And in this world, cinema offers compensations that you wouldn't find otherwise. There, one can fill one's shrinking self with images of life as such, and that's language that you would find in Kracauer. Material existence, as it manifests itself in film, claimed Kracauer, launches the moviegoer into unending pursuits. And these pursuits go in two directions, into the image or away from it. On the one hand, we have self-abandonment. On the other, self-absorption. In this way, films catalyze two types of dreaming. One that brings a spectator into the image in a contemplative embrace, another whose sights and sounds fuel the spectator's imagination, spurring associations and stimulating the memory. So, to summarize here, you've got a mobile spectator that Kracauer is talking about, and the spectator either moves into the image or away from it, either loses oneself in the diegesis or uses the flow of images as a catalyst for one's own reveries. And I'd like to suggest that inherent in this bidirectionality that is under discussion here, that we have the model for two types of an alternative cinema, and that these are to be found actually in the subsequent new German film. This choice between radical identification, and this is not the identification that the dominant cinema offers us, it goes beyond that. This choice between radical identification and willful free association, in fact, corresponds to the preferred subject effects of the two dominant paradigms in new German films of the 70s. On the one hand, we have filmmakers who allowed viewers a contemplative immersion in the image, directors whose mise-en-scène privileged the long take and called on the spectator to inhabit and explore the frame space. The obvious examples in this regard would be Wenders, Herzog, Stropier, Thomé, Achternbusch, Schroeter. On the other hand, there are those directors whose montage-driven films sought to spark spectators' memories and to spur their imaginations, filmmakers like Kluge, Zander, Reitz, even Zuberberg. Here, the single shot enjoys a less privileged status. Indeed, the stress lies on chain of images, a collage-like construction, a notion of film as a marketplace of competing discourses where the spectator is free to pick and choose as he or she will and to create his or her own Zusammenhang. Film narratives are not simply limited to captivating us by dint of their suspense, discomfort, or danger. They promote other responses as well. Waiting, wandering, hanging out, killing time, being absurd, being irreverent. So, this is really an eccentric kind of reception that we get in West Germany of Kracauer's theory of film, and is altogether at odds with the dismissive responses it received in Anglo-American circles, and both popular responses like that of, if you read the essay that Pauline Kael wrote in Film Quarterly, it is as dismissive as can be, but also subsequently in scholarly circles, from Dudley Andel to Noel Carroll to more recent scholars like Malcolm Turvey. As Rutschke put it, quote, "We found in the details," he's talking about theory of film, "many single observations whose incisiveness would not become clear until the 70s. So what he's saying is that in Germany, people were drawing on bits and pieces of the book, not considering it as a whole, and it had been precisely the study's perceived claim to being systematic that would consternate so many Anglo-American commentators. Now, one of the lessons we can draw from this, obviously, is that reception history has a lot to tell us about film theory, about the historical status of certain texts, in particular national and temporal constellations, that is to say, within concrete expectation horizons. Revisiting West German reception of Kracauer's monograph, I think, provides us a suggestive preview of coming attractions as we partake of recent scholarship that offers a fuller appreciation of Kracauer's redemptive resolve and his insight into the invigorating potential of the cinematic experience, so that this once so maligned and misapprehended monograph, I think, has come to serve much more productive purposes within film studies as new publications, for instance, by Heide Schlippmann, Christian Keithley's wonderful book on cinephilia, or more recently, Miriam Hansen's Cinema Experience. All of these convincingly demonstrate that. And these are contributions, I think, that help us at long last to fathom the book's historical dimensions, as well as its utopian designs. Now, in conclusion, I'd like to return to my point of departure and to the present moment. The impetus of Oberhausen was in a fundamental way similar to that of Kracauer's theory of film. One sought to redeem reality and combat a cinema of abstraction and amnesia, and a cinema of irreality. It stands to reason that representatives of the so-called Berlin School, a counter-cinema that since the turn of millennium has gained wide regard as a German Nouvelle Vague, have played a prominent role in recent remembrance of Oberhausen. Young directors like Christian Petzold, Angela Schanelek, but above all, Christoph Hochhäusler, who's been very vocal in these discussions about Oberhausen. All of these directors share an aesthetics of reduction and restraint, a penchant for image-focused rather than plot-driven constructions, a veristic resolve marked by the investment in the here and now, and a desire to negotiate the quotidian spaces as well as the less charted places of contemporary Germany and Europe, quadrants in which transit sites often become twilight zones. Theirs is a cinema of observation, not fabrication, more monstrative than narrative. And I think this cinema of non-intervention is, as Hochhäusler and others have emphasized, marked by Kracauer's initiative to redeem physical reality, resolve that, as stated, was essential to the Oberhausen initiative. Title of this conference, Provokation der Wirklichkeit. And I would add, though, that this is a resolve that in crucial ways assumed altogether different shapes. I wouldn't want to argue that what we find in the work of the Oberhausen signatories is altogether of a piece formally with what we find in that of the Berlin School, but there is a certain common impulse. There are common impulses, and we can talk about that. Quite adamantly, the directors of the young German film, as well as the Berlin School, assail the Realitätsferne of the dominant cinema, the absurd contrivances of mainstream offerings, their implausible constructions, their spurious harmonies. Very few German productions, Christian Petzold insists, revealed what today's Federal Republic really looks like and grant a more profound sense of how it feels to reside in post-millennial Europe. Berlin School features negotiate displaced places and historical voids. They emphasize sites off the beaten track, rarely traverse sectors of the country and the continent. Cameras insistently fix on people in motion. Think of Nina Hoss walking down the street at the, in various films by Petzold. And what you get here is a keen experience of physis, right? And reality seen in this way encompasses the province of physical things and human bodies, the empirical world apprehended in its diversity and complexity rather than corseted within generic constraints and subordinated to the imperatives of narrative trajectories. The Oberhausen signatories revolted against codified ways of seeing and sought to redefine film and to reinvent the cinema. They privileged Gegenbilder and more expansive and complicated understandings of reality, perspectives that were at once unvarnished and outlandish, and let us be honest, quite often schoolmasterly. Respecting the weight of images and recognizing the substantial ethical responsibility of a medium that traffics in facsimiles of the real, Berlin School productions have likewise reanimated international enthusiasm for a nation's film culture, a cinema that had become insignificant and all but invisible since the mid-'80s, after the death of the Fassbinder, and with him the demise of an Autorenkino. As a bastion of observation rather than fabrication, the Berlin School has revived and updated the critical and creative resolve articulated a half-century ago by a group of young activists, confirming that the incentive of Oberhausen has not diminished in its urgency and ongoing importance. Thank you.